Hi, my name is Roxanne Fenton, and I am the manager in career and professional development at Art Center. And I am here to talk to you today about presenting your work. Specifically, I'll be talking about presenting group work. So as an overview of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk about starting with the end, which is a way of thinking about your presentation and how you're going to organize it, what you're going to include and why. I'm going to talk about knowing your audience, because the audience is also going to shape what you talk about and why. And then how to tell a story to connect all the elements of your presentation. Before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about coming together. This is a group project, and so the group has to work together on the presentation, whether one person is presenting or multiple people of the group are presenting. Everybody in the group needs to understand the different elements of the project and how they fit together. So you can't get away with just talking about what you've created. You have to think about the project as a whole. And that's kind of starting from the end as well. You're starting from the end as a group, thinking about the overall project and how all of the different parts come together. Now, you may not have a lot of time to put your presentation together, so I encourage you to do something else, which I call plan while you create. As you are working, as you are creating the elements of your project, you can be planning your presentation. Maybe you're not taking time to write things down, but you're reflecting. You're reflecting on your part of the project. You're reflecting on how it relates to the other parts of the project. You're reflecting on the big ideas that you've described as a group, that you've identified that you're all working with. If you're all thinking about that while you create, you'll be much further along when you get together as a group to actually put your presentation together. So start with the end. What does that mean? This is a way of pulling back from the details of creation and thinking about the project as a whole, thinking about its end, its goal, where it's going, and how it's getting there. And it's also a way of thinking about the presentation itself. So you're going to do context. Pulling back from the details of the creation, what's the larger idea that you're working on? What is the context for the work that you need to share? Second, what's the main idea? Not only what's the larger idea, but what's the main focus? How have you decided to address that larger idea? And where is it all going? And then thinking of the outcome of the presentation, not just what you have to put in the presentation, but what do you want the audience to be able to do after hearing your presentation? And I'm going to come back to this idea in a minute because I think it's an important one that really helps you get a grasp and a handle on the whole overall focus of your presentation. All right, so that main idea, that project outcome, what are you being asked to make and why? You may have this from your assignment. What's the goal of the assignment that you've been given by your faculty? Or maybe you were given a specific design brief and the goal is contained in that. But what you're going to focus on is your take on what you are making. And I have some questions to help you think about that. So here are some key questions related to that project outcome and your role in it. Okay, what's the project about at the most basic level? And what are its goals? Now, what guided your research? What ideas did you start with? What ideas did you reject along the way? How did research inform creation, which informed further research? What new questions do you have at this stage of the project? As we create, we solve some things, but that often opens up new avenues to pursue and new ideas. So what are next steps or new ideas generated by the project? Now, of course, you'll have to decide which of these general questions are most relevant to the presentation that you're giving with the goals that you have for it and what you've been asked to do. But if you're in a group, it should be clear from the presentation what your unique role is and what your unique contribution is. And I mean that for each person in the group. It should be clear who's doing what, and it's an opportunity to say who came up with specific ideas that the group as a whole is pursuing. Some key phrases to use to help identify what you're doing. I want to design a character that has a feeling of loneliness. I'm trying to design an environment that has a feeling of otherworldliness. I have designed a prop that has a feeling of being very solid. So I filled in the blanks there. These are key phrases that you can use in different forms as you talk about the work in relation to these other key questions. I have another slide of key questions related to explaining what you're doing and the motivations behind it. So, what was your thought process, individually and as a group? And there are different ways to get at this. What questions motivated you? What questions were you asking about the characters, about the environments, about the props? Are you trying to express or evoke any emotions? If so, which ones? And again, refer back to that previous slide with those keywords and phrases that you can use. That really helps you get at and explain to the audience what you're trying to evoke. And what's the relationship between form and content? How do the shapes, the lines, the colors, the style, how do all of those formal elements build up to create the content? How do they build into what you're trying to express or evoke? This is where we really get to see your thought process, and we really get to see how you're putting it all together. You can also address challenges and how you overcame them. You're not apologizing for the work, and you're not trying to say, oh, we're stuck here, but you can present things that were maybe a little bit difficult, or that really caused you to think, or that you had to try several times before you arrived at the solution that you're currently going with. And be sure to talk about what you think is most successful, what you think is really working. You don't necessarily have to say that it's the most successful, but make sure that you're covering it. Okay, earlier I said the audience should be able to do something with the material that you give them in your presentation. And this is a very active stance. You're thinking about the audience as an active partner in this presentation. So you want the audience to be able to maybe describe the character and the character's basic traits. Maybe you want them to be able to list different elements of the environment, identify key props, explain how the environment contributes to the overall feel of the project, or demonstrate how a character's formal elements create its feeling and help build up who that person is. Okay, to do all of that, you need to know your audience. You have to think about who they are, what they know, and what they don't know. Are you giving this just to your classmates? Is there an industry guest attending? You're not giving this to empty chairs, of course. You have to think about the people who are receiving the information that you're sharing. So, what shared knowledge do you have? Shared vocabulary, shared ideas, shared knowledge of design process. What shared context do you have? Does your audience know the story that you're working with? Does your audience know the overall shape of the project? This is going to be very different if you're just presenting to the class, say in a weekly critique, or if you are presenting to an industry guest. And it's going to be even more different if you're presenting to an industry guest or an audience of people who are not also creatives. So then you have to think about, what knowledge do you have that's unique, that the audience doesn't have? And what context do you have that the audience doesn't have? You're the one with the insight into the artistic process, with how things are related, with what you tried to put in. And you want to share that with your audience as much as they need to know. So in order to start at the end and think about your presentation outcome, you have to think about who you're presenting to and what they know and what they don't know. Tell a story. You are storytellers. Somehow, through your artwork, you are working to tell a story or to convey aspects of a story. So you can be storytellers too in your presentations. And this is a way that you're going to connect all of the elements in your presentation together. Just like a TV show has, most TV shows today have events that carry over from one episode to another. And you have to watch the whole season to get the whole story. You want to connect the different elements of your presentation together so that you're not just saying, okay, this is our first character. All right, this is the next character. This is the first sketch of the environment. This is the second sketch of the environment. But how are these all related? How do they come together to tell the story of the creation of these characters and these environments? So think about what a story is. At the very least, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Usually the beginning sets the stage. That's that context that I mentioned earlier, the background that you need to understand the story. The middle has details. It may have problems. It may have triumphs, successes. And you leave the story with a clear overall message, with a clear sense of what happened. And you want to have those elements in your presentation as well. Here's another way to think about the story. Think of it as change over time. You have the past. You have what's already happened. What's the setup that's already been done? Who are the characters in your story? Are they you as the creators? Are they the designs? What's in the present? Where are things now? What's the current state of the work? This is where you're sharing all of the details now that we have the context, now that we have the background. This is where things are really happening. And then you have the future. Where's this going? What happens next? Is there anything that still needs to be solved? Maybe not. Maybe you're presenting a final work. Maybe if you're pitching, you're not going to include what needs to be solved, and the pitch is going to be, the future is going to be having them pick up this story to use the artwork to tell the story, to create the film or the game or whatever it is that you've been working on. But you have to think about how these things are connected. This is where you're doing that planning as you're creating. You're thinking about how everything relates to the story that you're telling and how all of the pieces relate together, how form and content are related, as I mentioned earlier. Tying it all together, that's what's making it a story. And I'll just tie this back to something I brought up earlier. You've got context, you've got your main idea, and you've got your outcome. That makes a basic story. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that, though it definitely can be. It's just a way to think about tying all the material together. All right, something to think about as you're preparing is that listening is not reading. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we listen to a presentation, it's a different brain activity than when we read something. And so it's a different activity to create a presentation to be listened to than it is to write something that's going to be read. First of all, when you're reading, you can go back and reread anytime you want to. If you didn't understand something, if it went by too fast, even if you just want to think about it more, you don't get to do that in a presentation when you're in the audience. So as a presenter, you need to think about how your audience is taking in the information and give them clues to help understand the structure of your presentation. Now, I've done this a lot with slides and moving between slides, but I've also done it with repetition and some other structures. And I'm going to talk more about those in just a minute. But one way to make sure that you are preparing your presentation to be listened to is not to write it all out. Don't work from a written presentation. Instead, work from an outline. There's a sample outline. And the outline helps you think about how the different aspects of what you're talking about are all related. Here's a different outline that's thinking about it more as a story with events, characters, conflicts, problems. In any case, this is an ongoing process. You start maybe as a group outlining how the presentation is going to go, what things you need to cover. And then you practice the different elements of it. And you decide, no, we should move the second story element should actually be the first story element. It makes more sense if things go in this order. And then you try it again. And you revise your outline as you work through preparing to tell it. So you're outlining and practicing and revising and practicing some more so that by the end, you know what you're talking about and you're using your outline to hang that all together. Okay, you can give your audience clues to what they're listening to with various elements of how you talk. One is the pitch. If you have a rising pitch, that tends to mean things are ongoing. Wait for the next bit. Or we're asking a question. When you use a down going pitch, a lowering pitch, that tends to suggest that something is finished. That here, I'm going to give you a moment to think about that. You can slow down to highlight key elements of what you're talking about. You don't want to speed over those and just talk nonstop with everything going together. You want to slow down and let your audience have a chance to let those key ideas sink in. And you can also use pauses for some of the same effects to emphasize, maybe to build tension. And then there's the stress you put on the words so that you lean into the most important words and you emphasize the things you want the audience to make note of. Maybe you want to say, now we're going to talk about the environments. That signals a shift for the audience that you are shifting to a new portion of your presentation. So you can use your voice. There's a lot you can do with your voice to help give your audience clues to how to follow along. All right, that's what I have for you today. If you have questions, you can always email me at roxanne.fenton@artcenter.edu. And just note the spelling of my first name there, or it won't get to me. And CPD has a lot of resources that can help you, not necessarily just with presentation skills, but with lots of different professional development areas. Our website is artcentercpd.com, and you can follow us on Instagram at artcentercpd. Thank you for listening.